Buonasera, good evening, and welcome to our second encounter as part of the lecture series in memory and celebration 50 years with Nostra Aetate. I'm Father Philip Renches, director of the Cardinal Meyer Center, the organizer, together with the Office for Ecumenical and Interreligious Dialogue of the Italian Bishops' Conference, LACEI, organizer of this event. As I had the opportunity a week ago in the presentation of our first encounter, this lecture series in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate is zooming in on the very meaning of memory itself. Zikaron, a central activity and component of the Jewish tradition, taken up and followed by Christ himself in the Eucharistic mneme, do this in memory of me. It is well known, however, it is also still worth recalling how the liturgical calendar of both synagogue and church has tried to make coincide a linear, progressive development of the history of God's relation with the created world, the so-called salvation history, to make this linear history of salvation may coincide with the circular evolution of nature in which the rotation of the earth in itself and around the sun is reflected in the alternation of the year's seasons in which the annual calendar of the liturgy in the synagogue and the church is inserted. The once and for all of God's actions is once every year reenacted in the liturgical celebrations, Easter, Pesach, Christmas, Hanukkah, Pentecost, Shavuot. How does this affect our act to memorize, our doing memory? It is this question that is given to tonight's speakers to further explore, to investigate for us, with us. Rabbi David Meyer and Father Felix Körner, both, I'm proud to say, especially in the case of Rabbi David Meyer, professors here at the Gregorian University. Please allow me to introduce both speakers right now to allow the flow and interaction between them without interruption later on. Rabbi David Meyer has been invited professor at the Cardinal Meyer Center for 7 years now. His contributions in Jewish theology and in particular in the Jewish-Christian dialogue and also the Jewish-Christian-Muslim dialogue is world known. First of all, he started acting as a man of dialogue between these religious traditions as a rabbi. For many years he was leader of a community. Then his teachings in various parts of the world, through newspaper articles published in Israel and the Jewish diaspora in Europe and in the New World, and many books, among which I would like to mention here Painful Verses, Bible, Gospel at Qumran, Between Conflict and Dialogue, which he published together with Sohaib Pincheg and Yves Simons in 2008, and in 2014 came out an English translation of this book, and lately La Vocation de la Terre Sainte, also a Jewish, Christian, Muslim regard on the land of Israel. Father Felix Körner, born and raised in my neighborhood in Offenbach in Germany, joined the Society of Jesus in 1985. His teaching assignments in Fribourg, Switzerland, Frankfurt, Germany, Ankara, and the Gregorian University, is one of the world experts in the theology of religions. His research focus is on contemporary Quran interpretations, a topic on which he published, among many other publications, the book Revisionist Quran Hermeneutics in Turkey. He, at the Gregorian University, teaches aside or next to theology of religions, sacramental theology, so he's really an expert of these two worlds, dialogue and liturgy, which we are looking for tonight. Father Felix Körner is member of the Pontifical Commission for Religious Relations to Muslims. Briefly, how this evening is going to unfold. Each speaker is given around 35 minutes for the relation, for their conference, and then there is space around 20-25 minutes for a dialogue between themselves and a dialogue with all you here being present. Thank you very much.
Father Ranches, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. I'm extremely happy to be here. I mean, I work with Philip on a daily basis at the Cardinal Bell Center, so it's sort of nice to somehow be formally here together. And also, of course, Felix, which I know for many years, and okay, we call ourselves by our first name, but you know, we're not that many. We can have, I think we can somehow do with that, maybe too much formality. So I'm really delighted that we share this table today. We don't have a lot of time, as was reminded, so I'd like to start by jumping into the subject rather abruptly. And to first of all start with maybe just the title that is written here at the top that you have, Memory and Memories, which is really memory and memories in the annual liturgical calendar, which somehow, as you can see, has two mentions of the word memory. The first one in the singular, the second one in the plural. All that in the context of liturgy and the annual cycle, which suggests, for me at least, and this will be my personal take on this, that in the wake of Nostra Aetate, so 50 years ago, which in itself is in the shadow of the Shoah, the memories of the past, and I put memories here in the plural, the memories of the past, even though they have been very efficiently transmitted through the liturgical cycle, might need to be reinvented into a different kind of memory, which this time would be eventually in the singular. In particular, memory in the singular being the memory for us of the tragedy of the 20th century, the memory of Auschwitz, the memory of the Shoah. So this presentation, within the time that is given to me, will be for me an opportunity to explore, if you want, various aspects of the commemoration of the Shoah and how is that inscribed in the liturgical calendar of the Jewish tradition, but with a little twist, and the twist being that this, in the shadow of the inspiration that Nostra Aetate provides for Judaism when we think about transmitting memory. So it's about the memory of the Shoah, but through the glass of Nostra Aetate. So I will divide my presentation into two sections. The first one, which will be somehow a more theoretical argument as to why I'm going to say what I'm going to say. And the second part will be three examples of how Judaism has tried to be creative about memory in the recent years, in particularly in commemoration of the Shoah. So what I would like to do is to start with a quote which you will no doubt feel is very removed from the topic, and it's true, it is quite removed, but somehow it is something that's going to bring us back in an interesting way to the topic. The quote is from the book of Numbers, as you have at the top, and you have the translation here at the end, and I'll just read it to you in English. It's quite a straightforward passage. It's about the description of the arch, the description of the tabernacle when the tabernacle was in movement during the 40 years in the wilderness. So it says, "And it came to pass when the ark set forward that Moses said, 'Rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let them that hate you flee before you. And when it rested, it says, Return, O Lord, unto the 10,000s of the families of Israel.'" So it's a well-known passage about the ark being in movement, but there is one thing which is interesting in that passage, and this is a snapshot from the Torah scroll. And the interesting thing that you have here is there is a sort of a scribble oddity in the text, which is this. the two little extra letters that you have, which is called, that's why I call the topic, the story of the two nunim. It's the letter N, the nun in Hebrew, which is here inverted, but it plays a role like it brackets those two verses that I've quoted. They're sort of within brackets, okay? And the question when you see something like this is certainly to wonder, what's the point? What's the point of this? So I concede that this looks rather removed from our topic, but I'd like you to bear with me just for a minute about this. I think in order to try and understand why is this oddity of the scriptural text, why is it there, I'd like to turn to the Talmudic passage that is associated with this, together with a little commentary, and as you'll see, this will bring us back immediately into the thrust of the argument in quite a powerful way. So let me read to you here briefly the passage from the Talmud. It's from Tractate Shabbat, and this is what it says about the previous section I've shown you. Rabbis taught, and then they quote the verse, and it came to pass when the ark set forward that Moses said, etc., etc. For this section, the Holy One, blessed be He, provided the signs above and below, so the two nunim that I've shown, to teach us that this passage of Torah is not in its place, which is rather a remarkable statement because the Torah is supposed to be perfect. But suddenly you have a passage that looks like it's in bracket to teach us that this is not in its place. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, this section is not in its place. Why? Because it is destined to be removed from here and written later on, we suppose, in its right place. So the section is out of place, and later on it will come back into its right place. So if it has to come back to its right place, the Talmud asks the question, so why is it not in the right place in the first place, since you have to bring it back later on? And the answer is here quite astonishing. In order to provide a break between the first account of the punishment and the second account of punishment. And the rabbi in the second section of the text, which I'm skipping, are defining what are the punishment before, what are the punishment below, and it's bracketed because it creates a break between two sections of punishment. So this is the theoretical explanation of that passage, but so far it means nothing until you read maybe the commentary that appears right after. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel follows a different path of interpretation. I haven't quoted the whole thing, so. Verse 35 and 36, why are they displaced? They cannot find a proper place in the Torah because of the existence of evil in the world. This is what the punishments are about. There are two punishments, therefore there is suffering. And those suffering brings a situation of chaos, a situation of fury, a situation of anxiety, if you want. And this passage cannot find its place in the Torah because of this existence of evil in the world. The actual concern, says the commentary, is here immediately ethical. The displacement of the text translates the disorder of the world. In a world that is a world of fury and suffering, there is a displacement of the text that translates the disorder of the world. No text, whatever it might be, even if written by the hand of God, could claim to rejoice of a pretend order in a world where fury and chaos, injustice and despair are being heard so clearly. So that, for me, is a very powerful message in which when we acknowledge at least the fact that we live in a world of chaos and disorder, we have to face that chaos and that disorder within our own teaching, within our own quotes, which might be displaced, which might be out of place. Now, from a Jewish perspective, the teaching of the church following Nostra Aetate 50 years ago is, I think, precisely about this. After the disorder, the chaos, the fury of the Shoah, the church acknowledged somehow that in its own teaching, there was something that was out of place, that needed to be amended. There was something that was not quite right, not quite at the right place. And if something must be amended, then it's because deep down, there is a recognition that some sort of disorder, some sort of error some sort of displacement in the ethical teaching of the church have taken place over the centuries, which led to acts and teaching of anti-Semitism throughout the ages. Now, faced with this sort of amazing courage, when we look at it from a Jewish perspective, this amazing courage, this audacity, and this wisdom of the church through the work of Nostra Aetate, many Jewish communities and many Jews within the Jewish communities felt that a Jewish response to Nostra Aetate was needed. And in particular, there's one of these responses which I have put here, which is coming from a text, which is a very well-known text, and I've put here just the beginning of it, which is called Dabru Emet, which was published in 2000. And it's a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity written by some Jewish scholars and people of responsibility in the community. So here's what it says, because it encapsulates something quite interesting. In recent years, there has been a dramatic and unexpected shift in Jewish and Christian relationships. Throughout the nearly 2 millennia of Jewish exile, Christians have tended to characterize Judaism as a failed religion, or at best, a religion that prepared the way for and is completed in Christianity. In the decades since the Holocaust, however, Christianity has changed dramatically. It's the change of that disorder of the quote that I've used. An increasing number of official church bodies, both Roman Catholic and Protestant, have made public statement of their remorse about Christian mistreatment of Jews and Judaism. These statements have declared, furthermore, that Christian teachings and preaching can and must be reformed. And again, we have an echo here of the text out of place should be put back where it should be, so somehow this kind of change, so that they acknowledge God's enduring covenant with the Jewish people and celebrate the contribution of Judaism to world civilization and to Christian faith itself. And that's the audacity that Judaism recognizes in Nostra Aetate. But then they add, and that follows immediately from there, I've separated in 2 bullet points, but in fact it really follows up. We believe these changes merit a thoughtful Jewish response. And so the question becomes really, how does Judaism respond not only to Nostra Aetate in terms of engaging in dialogue, but how Judaism can be inspired not necessarily by the text of Nostra Aetate, but by the courage and the audacity of Nostra Aetate, who's looked into the disorder of its own teaching, trying to put it back in a sort of more ethical order. Responding to Nostra Aetate at one level, it means for Judaism to engage with the church. It's to refuse to consider Judaism as an island. It's to refuse to consider that we have nothing to do with Christianity. It's to engage. That's one of the reasons I'm here and I'm teaching here at the Gregorian. That's responding in many ways to Nostra Aetate. But the key question for me is not at the level of responding, it's at the level of being inspired, okay? And being inspired by the audacity of Nostra Aetate. And I think that in the realm of liturgy and memory, then Judaism maybe can match and be inspired by the audacity of Nostra Aetate, and I'd like to just take a little bit of time to explain why. Now in Judaism, very often we consider ourselves to be wonderful experts in memories. And Philip, you've highlighted that. It's something that is shared by a tradition. We have many, many references to what memory means for our two religious tradition. The reference to memories are enormous. I cannot not quote. I mean, I'm not going to read the text, and it's pretty not easy to read here. But nevertheless, the Zachor that you've mentioned is also the title of a book by Yerushalmi, he wrote a little pamphlet, if you want, about memory. When he talks about memory, he points to the fact that there's 169 references to memory in the biblical text, as if this was something that was somehow completely obvious and we all knew exactly what memory was about. And all this is true. This emphasis on memory is extremely powerfully ingrained and rooted in Judaism, and it plays a central role, not only in the biblical narrative, but it plays a central role in the liturgical calendar and the way we Jews celebrate throughout the year. Whatever we do, whenever we do it, whatever celebration, whatever festival we have, it is always associated with some sort of memory. And I've made here a little snapshot of a summary of what it is, and you'll see there is something that here is quite interesting, because each time there is a celebration, there is an event that is associated with it, but that event is rooted in a reading, a text that you read. It's not just memory like this. It's memory engraved in a text. Shabbat, we remember the 6 days of creation, we remember the Exodus from Egypt, and it's all rooted in the reading of the Torah, the reading of the Haftarah, which are the liturgical reading of the Torah, the prophets, and so on. We have text that we read. Pesach, you mentioned it, the Exodus from Egypt, we read the Haggadah. For the Seder of Pesach, we read a text called the Haggadah. Shavuot, the giving of the Torah, we read the Ten Commandments, we read the scroll of Ruth. We refer to biblical text to root the memory in something tangible, something concrete. Sukkot, remember the 40 years in the wilderness? We sit in the sukkah and we read the scroll of Ecclesiastes. Purim, the time of the hiddenness of God, the victory over an attempted genocide, we read the scroll of Esther. Chanukah, that we just finished a few days ago, it used to be that we read the scroll of the Maccabim, not the text of the Maccabim, the Megillat HaChashmonaim, the Megillah of the Hasmonean, which is not read anymore in synagogue, but we read the prayer that talks about that scroll. So each time there is a reference to a memory, and the memory is associated with a text. The question that arises for us after the Shoah is, if we are good at memories, how do we commemorate the memory of Auschwitz? How do we do that? What liturgical commemoration can we envisage? And in particular, and this is why I've put that, what text should we read? What is it that we should read if, in fact, each time we try to remember something, we find a text that fits that memory? So what is the text that would fit? And here, for the first time, when we're facing the chaos, the disorder of the world after Auschwitz, there's one problem that arises, is that, in fact, I have no biblical book to read. I have no biblical book that can root the memory of the Shoah in a biblical narrative. And in fact, no one better than André Neher, which is one of my favorite French biblical exegeses from the Jewish tradition, when he made a commentary to the earliest book of Elie Wiesel, he encapsulated that idea in an extremely powerful way. This is what he said. The book is, it's a French book, but it is translated into English. The tragic grandeur of Wiesel's work lies in this desperate effort to make the Bible, in the face of Auschwitz, say what it cannot say, because it said what it did when Auschwitz had not yet come into existence. And the painful emotions aroused by Elie Wiesel's first books are largely due to this endeavor to place the word of the witness of Auschwitz within a book which can finally only be silent. In other words, and I think this is what it says, the Bible does not stand up to Auschwitz. Auschwitz doesn't fit into the Bible, and so I have no book that I can associate with the memory of Auschwitz if I try to recreate a liturgy for that memory. In a world which is chaos and fury, there is a basic, therefore, insufficiency, imperfection, incompleteness of the biblical text. It's incomplete. I don't have the text that I need. And this is where, as Jews, I think we need to be inspired by the audacity of Nostra Aetate in its own Christian context, which is very much about facing the incompleteness and the imperfection of its own teachings. So we need to match that audacity with our own creative liturgical audacity. Now, matching the audacity doesn't mean that we have to respond to Nostra Aetate at a parallel level, because for the Church, Nostra Aetate, in the shadow of the Shoah, was about facing the teaching of contempt and transforming the teaching of contempt into the teaching of respect, to quote Jules Isaac. For Judaism, it has to be different. It's not the same story, it's not the same problem, it's not the same responsibility. The task is different, but if the task is different, the audacity that is required is exactly the same in terms of the value of that audacity. Now, in Judaism, there's one area where we do need some level of audacity, and that's the area of liturgy, and in particular the connection between liturgy and memory. And I would like to show you this brief Talmudic text here, another one, which is quite interesting because even though it was said a long, long time ago, and it was said in relationship to the destruction of the temple, how much more so is it true in light of the memory of the Shoah? Rabbi Eliezer said, "From the day on which the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer have been closed." And I know that last week, when you had the first encounter was about the healing power of prayer. And yet we have a Talmudic text that says the gates of prayer have been closed. As it is said, when I cry, I call for help, he shuts out my prayer. But though the gates of prayer are closed, the gates of weeping are not closed. As it is said, hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear into my cry. Keep not silent at my tears. And it goes even further. Eleazar also said, since the day that the temple was destroyed, a wall of iron has intervened between Israel and their Father in heaven. Not only I don't have prayer, but there's a wall of iron, and the only thing I am left with is really the theology of tears. And that is a creative thinking already at the time of the destruction of the temple, as recorded in the Talmud by Rabbi Eliezer. And Fackenheim rework, if you want that text, you can read it by yourself, but he points to a very poignant interrogation saying, what is left? What is left for us if not that theology of tears that we might need to decreate if we want to connect again in an honest and in a sincere way with God? And this, therefore, is what brings me to the second part, is how do we translate that theology of tears, that audacity that is rooted in Nostra Aetate, which I want to be inspired from, and bringing into the realm of liturgy within Judaism. And what I want to do is to share with you 3 examples, briefly but visual, as to what Judaism has been able to come up with. It's audacious, it's extremely controversial, but it is, though, a necessary step, even though it might be disregarded later. So far, when it comes to the memory and inserting the memory of the Shoah in the liturgical calendar, the only thing we have is a date. We have the 27th of Nisan, which is called Yom HaShoah ve'Gvura, the day of commemoration of the Shoah and the commemoration of heroism. But apart from the date, we don't have much in terms of what it is that we read. And there are 3 attempts which you have here. The first one is a little booklet, which I'll talk about, which is written by Elie Wiesel and Albert Friedlander, 2 Jewish theologians, which is called The 6 Days of Destruction, Meditation Towards Hope, which is a possible interfaith liturgy that was completely created out of nothing. The second one, which I'll go very quickly over because I don't have time, is a sort of an Agada for the Seder of Yom HaShoah, which is just like we have the Agada for Pesach and the Seder of Pesach. There was an attempt to recreate another Seder at a different date, but to commemorate the Shoah. And the third one, which I'll talk a little bit more because I was very involved with it, is the Megillat HaShoah, the Shoah Scroll, a Holocaust liturgy, which is another kind of booklet which I will try to show you in a minute. The first one, the little booklet, The 6 Days of Destruction, you have a picture of the book. It's about 60 pages. The 6 Days of Destruction, a Jewish calling for Christian prayers. That's how it's called inside. It's difficult to sum up. It's not a very well-known book, though it's an extremely smart and daring endeavor. And I have a real soft spot for that book, even though it obviously went nowhere. It didn't work as such, but I think the effort is worth mentioning. Now, I don't have time to read the thing, obviously, but I have chosen a few things here and there. The first thing, of course, that comes up is this idea of the 6 days of destruction, which is quite a daring title. It's about telling the destruction as we read the creation story. It's a sort of a parallel. There is a creation, there is a destruction. It's a call for sort of prayer together, but it's not just prayer. It's also a book that if you don't want to pray, you can read. And if you don't just want to read, you can study. And what I want to do, and to show you how audacious it can be, is let me just read to you some of the preface that are given. A double preface by coming out of the Christian world. I don't think there's ever been an attempt at Jewish liturgy which is introduced by personalities from the Christian world. It's pretty audacious, maybe too much for many, I don't know. But this is what it is, whether it's the Cardinal Hume, whether it's the Bishop Richard Harris. Just read the first little bit here. Part of the process of reconciliation has to be the healing of memories in shared grief and the patient effort to accept the other's history and identity within it. We come as we are to this process. We shed nothing of our inheritance, but only what is sinful. So we do shed. We seek to refocus everything in the light of God's love and concern for a soul. But I am particularly interested with the second text, that's the one here. If the religions of the world are to make a constructive contribution to solving the problem of humankind, then a new religious approach will be necessary. There is again that audacity that comes. This does not entail deserting or betraying one's own religious tradition, but it does mean approaching one's own religious tradition and that of the other in a new spirit. In particular, we need not only an affirmation of our own religious tradition, but a properly critical attitude towards it. That is, an awareness of when it has gone wrong and a reflection on the question of why it has gone wrong. The honesty is ingrained from the beginning, but that double introduction, as you can guess, is also combined with something which then becomes, and this is why I have a soft spot for this, even more audacious. It's a Jewish call for Christians in search of prayer, translating the fact that in order to share the grief, we Jews need Christians to pray with us, but maybe not in the way Christians are used to pray. And that's where it might be difficult. This is what it says. How can we give you words when there are no words? We echo here the words of André Neher. The Bible and Auschwitz don't fit together. The 6 days of destruction opens a door. You enter it of your own volition, and a heart of flesh and blood is exchanged for a heart of stone. It's the other way around. Our souls are frozen by the glimpse of hell, and we must warm ourselves at the fires of our tradition so that the icy horror can give way to compassion, compassion for all who died, compassion for all who lived, compassion for our neighbors and for ourselves, and compassion for God. Yes, compassion for God, because in front of a God who was so silent, what else can I say? And what the invitation is about is, on those terms, can we pray together or not? Is it possible to envisage a prayer and a compassion towards God? And that's the theology of tears that I was talking about. In the second introduction here, it goes even further. It says, but can we really pray, in fact? What about those who cannot pray? And there's a beautiful passage here. The night was too long and too dark. The break was absolute. There are many in the Jewish tradition, in the Christian tradition, outside religious tradition, who have lost faith and who reject faith in the days after the Holocaust. We can understand this, and we will not force faith. We will not demand prayer, because prayer can deceive. Prayer can deceive because it can make us feel that we have solved problems which are beyond solution, that we have escaped into light, when in fact we have only blocked out the darkness. on those terms, is it possible to have a joint sort of remembrance and prayer? It's very particular. It's a very, very particular approach. I think it's something extremely smart. I think it's something extremely audacious, but I would say maybe it is too audacious. Maybe it is too demanding. Maybe it's too much of a stretch, and maybe it's not the time. But I appreciate certainly the attempt that was done here. Now, because I don't have a lot of time left, I'm going to skip the second one. So you'll just see the picture, but nothing else, which is the Seder of Yom HaShoah. And I want to come to the third thing, which is the Shoah scroll, which is a topic that I know quite well because I've worked on it. And if you're interested, I'll have the Shoah scroll here for those who want to see and discuss it later, if you have time. The Shoah scroll, what is it? What is it? It's a little book. It's a little book like this. It's a narrative in 6 chapters again about the Shoah, but it's a narrative which is built in the form of the book of Esther, of the scroll of Esther in the Bible. Not in the content, but of course in the form. And not just in the form, but in fact in the language. This book is written by Avigdor Shinan, by the way, and it's written in biblical Hebrew. The last one who really wrote about biblical Hebrew is probably Maimonides. But apart from Maimonides, many centuries ago, nobody has written in biblical Hebrew. The idea is to say, just like the book of Esther is read to commemorate Purim, should we not read a book to commemorate the Shoah? That's what this story is about. So what do you have inside? Here I've just given you the content, the table of content. You have the 6-chapter story, biblical Hebrew. It's filled with intertextuality in it. It's a very powerful account of the Shoah. But at the same time, it's an account that is more suggestive than revealing. It doesn't go as far as being obscene in being too explicit about what the Shoah was. It's about suggesting so that the reader, the one who wants to understand, can actually understand by himself with his own imagination. So there is explicit and there is implicit material in that text. But what was interesting with this book, because it was called a Megillah, a scroll, when I saw the book, which is this, I called the people who published it, and I said, what about transforming it into a scroll? Okay, a scroll, like you would read a proper scroll. Because after all, if it's called a Shoah scroll, it can't be a booklet. It has to be a scroll. So the question was, can we transform the story that you read on printed page into something like this? And what's the point of it? First question is it heretical to transform a text into a scroll? Because if you transform it into a scroll and you follow the scribal rules, doesn't it suggest that after all, you're adding to the biblical canon? Just like you have the scroll of Esther, then you have the scroll of the Shoah. And my answer to that, and I won't go into the detail, lack of time, but I have it here. I don't think basically it is. I don't think it is heretical, because after all, in the Talmud, it is the rabbis of the Talmud who decides what's in and what's out of the biblical canon. So there is a precedent. And I'm not suggesting that we should just come and impose the thing. I've just suggested that, let's do it. We'll see. In 200 years, we'll see whether it was a bad idea, whether it was a good idea. If we don't try, we don't try. But why not trying and see? Maybe it's a good idea. Maybe it's not a good idea. It doesn't matter. I don't feel any pressure on that score. So I don't think it's heretical, but I'll skip on this because it's an interesting thing in itself, but I'll skip on this. But the main thing was actually, what does it add to transform a written text into a proper scroll? What does it add? First of all, the first thing it adds is it inscribes the text into its proper liturgical format, and by being so bold, it highlights the importance of the text clearly. It's not just another text on a piece of paper. So there's that obvious element, but the most important thing for me is what comes after. Because what comes after is, when you write a scroll, you have to follow some rules. And you can't just write whatever you want, whenever you want. You have to follow the rules of sofrut, which is the scribal rule. And when you follow the scribal you can be a bit creative as well as to how you write it. And when you are creative in the way you write it, what happens is that you inscribe, for those who want to take the time to read it, you inscribe some theological statement that you wouldn't dare to put in writing proper. You use the tool of the writing and the shape of the letter in order to say something that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily say. Nachmanides used to say, Amaskil yavin, the one who wants to understand will understand. I don't need to be explicit. Here it's a little bit the same thing, and I just want to finish by showing you 3 or 4 of those examples which are here and which are a little bit in bigger words after. We had some issues and some problems. In chapter 1 of this book, it talks about Nazi Europe. What happened in Nazi Europe is different from what happened in the previous history of Judaism. How do you write the word Nazi in a book that is supposed to be a scroll? Following the rules. Particularly because you're supposed to destroy the memory of Amalek. If the Nazis are the epitome of Amalek, and you have to erase the memory of Amalek, how do you write the name Nazi in a book where at the same time you're supposed to erase? So what we did, if you look at the top here, the very big corner at the top, and the 3 words here, we had different things. The second one in the middle has thinner letters. You can thin the letters. As long as it's readable, it's kosher scroll. You can thin the letters to sort of erase something, but we were still unhappy with it. So what we came up was another trick of the tradition, which is called a kriktiv, which is a deliberate spelling mistake. If you don't want to write a word, you can deliberately make a spelling mistake in the text in order not to write it. And in fact, if you read Hebrew, we don't have time, but if you read Hebrew, you see that the word as it appears in the scroll, and you'll see it here, doesn't read as natzit. Eventually, naitzt, but not natzit, because you interpret the letters. So the reader knows he has to read it as natzit, but the writer doesn't have to write it. So there was this sort of first issue that was here. The other thing we wanted to do, picking up on the passage from Deuteronomy when it calls on the Shema, the declaration of faith, with normally Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, the word Echad is usually written with a large letter D at the end. What we wanted to do was somehow to inscribe in the text the feeling that there is a reduced perception of the divine. So we've reduced some of the letter. Okay, you have the small dalet at the end. There's a few others letters in the book, in the scroll, that have been reduced, but the idea is we didn't want to be too explicit and to just say it as such, black on white, but we wanted to inscribe the emotion. So that maybe when generations later people look at this book, whether it works or it doesn't work, maybe they'll find this one and say, well, why is it that suddenly there's a small dalet and not a big dalet? What prompted that generation to write it in such a way? So we did that. We also wanted to inscribe it, the theology of tears. On a few passages, it talks on the remembrance of all of these, ani bochia, okay, I cry. There is a tag, a little tag is this. Just like you have the crowns, you have little tags on the things, which is called the tear tag. Now, the tear tag is not an invention of the one who did the scroll, because all of what we did was to look at existing oddities in the literature of Sofrut throughout the ages, and in particular, one book which is called the Sefer HaTagim, the book of the little oddities, which is a book that has disappeared. We only have quotes of that book, and we felt it was actually quite powerful as we commemorate and remember those who've disappeared that we've only heard about, to reuse the creativity of the book that has itself disappeared. Okay? So, you know, there is something that is inscribed, that theology of tears is inscribed. And the last one I want to show you, I'll finish with this, I've passed my time, I'm sorry, is at some stage here in chapter 5, we have, it talks about, you know, the world and its colorful multiplicity, with a sort of a play on words on the rainbow color, okay, the colors of the rainbow. The rainbow, of course, is the sign of the covenant, the earth was never destroyed. What we did, and again, is something that we did find in the Sefer HaTagim, is a broken rainbow on the top. Yes, the rainbow, but the world was almost destroyed. And so there is a notion of brokenness of the world that is inscribed in the book. So all this to say something, after all, in fact, very simple. The audacity of Nostra Aetate in the light of the Shoah, thinking about memory and liturgy, brings Judaism to think about creative way and audacious way. When you do so, you take risks. You take the risk of getting it wrong, of assessing the situation wrong. But somehow we felt that, in particular, this last one where I was very involved, there are some issues that can be put forward, and that is somehow a contribution to memory and memories in the liturgical calendar since Nostra Aetate. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for this very intensive conference. I'm aware that actually this conference would deserve now a pause or a reflection to let it sink in. But exactly in that same awareness, I'm also happy to introduce now Father Felix Körner.
Thank you very much, Philip. But do you want to give me the cable only? Actually, because this is probably the last engaging sentence I said. All the rest will be less interesting. Thank you. Yeah, and that also makes for a short break for you. We are celebrating 50 years of Vatican II. Why do we not celebrate such an event liturgically, annually, in the whole Church? And again, why not commemorate the Shoah in the Catholic liturgical year? These two questions will be tackled here. They also allow us to identify the fundamental meaning of liturgical commemoration. Theological reflection on the specific form of Christian memory will finally help us to develop critically the Vatican II conception of the human person, and therefore of religious liberty, interreligious dialogue, and intercultural encounters. For that, we need to do a theology of ritual. This is particularly exciting, liberating, and rewarding because the ritual is an inspiring, non-conceptual space to be entered. Ritual is the other great type of memory storage, as opposed to the book, the text. Scripture, if consulted in close reading without traditional ritual context, has reformative power, but also a radicalizing potential. When we look at rituals, we are not constructing, but we discover a symbolic world. Then we are not deducing from some presuppositions, but exploring what is going on. Not that it is an under-researched topic. Great study has been done on liturgy. Still, some angles are open for more theological exploration. And since we are not only dealing with liturgy as an institution fully designed and controlled by bureaucrats, but with subconscious habits and subcutaneous flows of tradition, with ever new growths and with fringes into manifold popular religiosities, the topic remains fluid and fresh. So I really only propose one thesis it is the church lives out of memory, but this thesis has several levels of significance, and then we'll also do some qualifications of the thesis later on. The church lives out of memory. Catholic life gets much of its rhythm from liturgy. In the course of each year, colors are changing. Christians wander through circles of feasts with varying atmospheres. The church lives out of memory. There is an interesting tension between civil and ecclesial rhythms. For brevity, let us here call the non-ecclesial living context the world. Then there are three types of realizing that tension between world and church in feast rhythms. Church inspiring world, world influencing church, and church contrasting world. The type world influencing church is present when we celebrate the birth of Christ on the Feast of the Sun, S-U-N, yeah? Towards the end of December. That in turn had an inspiring effect on the world. Think of the omnipresent Christmas tree, which good Catholics like to declare as pagan anyway, but which seems to have started off as a representation of the paradise tree, reread as the new tree of life, that is, as Christ's cross. A less obvious influence is that the December Christmas date had also an effect on worldly calendars. The change of the beginning of the public year happened through the Christmas date. For the Romans, the last month of the public calendar was February. And that is why it is the shortest and the only one that puts on the leap year's extra day. Because of the birth of Jesus, however, December became the last month that was finalized only with the Gregorian calendar. Christ's epiphany makes for a new beginning. That was also the reason why late antiquity Christianity wanted to count the first year of Jesus' life as year one. Another example for church-inspiring world is Sunday as day off. Even countries with tiny Christian minorities like Turkey observe the Sunday. So much of the church's visible influence onto the public sphere is through Christian memory. Sometimes the church, like many other religions, wants to accentuate, however, that her rhythms are not that of the world. Contrasts are treasured. Sometimes Christians oppose the idea of weekend, claiming that Sunday is the first day of the week, and the liturgical year does not start on January 1, but with the first Sunday of Advent. The church lives out of memory. That means also that Christians are constantly being nourished and inspired by memory. Therefore, they can nourish and inspire others. But again, that's not the whole story. The church lives out of memory means that the church gets her life, her origin, from her memorial celebration. The church came into being because of Christ's celebration. Do this in memory of me. That is the commission Jesus passed on, according to Paul and Luke, to his disciples when he had his Last Supper with them. Do this in memory of me is the institution, to use the technical term, of his memory. And this act of founding the celebration also came to be the institution of the church. However, attention. The church lives out of memory means more than Christians celebrate and thus remember and thus become better Christians. One can indeed say the one who is remembered, Christ, is also the one creating the memory. That is not only to say he instituted his memory by instruction. The correct terminology for this is rather Christ is the subject of his memoria. In the ecclesial sacramental practice, Christ is active. His death on the cross was not the end of his ministry. He was raised into the unlimited community of life with the one whom he called his heavenly Father. Christ is, therefore, the risen Lord of today. He has become life-giving Spirit. In every generation he is calling and sending his friends. Christ himself is reconstructing his distorted body as church. Therefore, the church is able to commemorate him and thus encounter him ever anew. In that, Jesus is the subject of his memoria, not only the object. Let us look at some of the vocabulary we are using when we are speaking like this. We are already in the middle of doing theology. Let us get our language clearer. Well, the words might not become much clearer. We are not introducing terminology. In its first centuries, Christianity does not define terminology, let alone construct it. The early church is rather using traditional vocabulary and, in the light of the life of Christ, discovers that there is new meaning to it. A first necessary remark on church vocabulary is precisely about the church. The church lives out of memory, we said. Liturgical talk often personifies the church. Indeed, the church is referred to as personal agent. Who is that? The church, that is, the spiritual dynamic which comes into being through Christian liturgy, and that makes Christian liturgy come into being. The church that is at the same time an institution with official representatives and the celebrating congregation of believers, local, universal, and trans-temporal. The church is the body of Christ. Still, the personifying reference to the church is dangerous talk. It can become a trick. Human beings may thus procure for themselves an unquestionable authority. The church lives out of memory. Is such talk then not an undue idealization of one human culture of remembrance? Is it not a clever self-absolutization? Yes, there is such a danger. Christians should only refer to themselves as the church under the following four conditions. We can call them the fourfold humbling ecclesial awareness. If Christians speak of themselves as the church, they must always remember that they owe their election, vocation and mission, their dignity to God's choice to integrate Gentiles into God's people. We are grafted into the tree that is Israel, as says Paul. The tree which was alive and growing before us. Secondly, being church is an unmerited gift that has to be handled in an ever new radical self-examination as to where the members do not live up to that claim of representing Christ today. Third, talk of the church as corporate person is based on the Paschal events. The reality of those events, that is, Christ's resurrection from the dead, has been disputed from the very first testimony on. In other words, not the whole world is Christian. And lastly, the reality of a corporate personality, that is the church, is ever challenged by the disunity of Christians. The church lives out of memory. Which memory? Fundamentally, the church commemorates only one particular series of events. The church celebrates the Paschal mystery. Paschal mystery, that is, in short, Jesus' life. Jesus' life, that is, his healing service in Galilee, his painful death in Jerusalem, his all-changing resurrection into God's eternal life, and his universal enthronement into the new kind of kingship in the Spirit. Jesus' life path thus unfolds in four great phases. Paschal is the adjective to Easter. The Easter events are being celebrated as Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, with the people hailing him as anointed Son of David on Palm Sunday. On Holy Thursday is the next step, Jesus' Last Supper and the events of the Mount of the Olive, prayer, betrayal, arrest. Good Friday commemorates Jesus' brutal suffering, crucifixion and death. On Sunday, the morning after the Sabbath, his tomb is discovered empty, and slowly the disciples, first the women, become convinced that he is risen from the dead. Jesus' path from suffering death to surprising life is then the core of the Paschal mystery. It is Paschal because it happened at Easter, in the structure of these 3 days. Even when it is celebrated in less than 1 hour in the Eucharist, or along weeks and weeks in the liturgical year, its link to Easter remains obvious. But why would one want to call this a mystery? The word has two roots. One reaches into the prophetic tradition of Israel, the other into pagan rites. In Israel, prophets may be granted a glimpse into the plan of God. They may see the sequence of eras that has come and that will come, the whole of this course of events, not yet visible to others, is the mysterion, the raz in the Aramaic of Daniel. The other root is non-Israelite. Pagan cults popular in late antiquity wanted to offer more involving, exciting forms of worship, not only the sacrificial ceremonies of the temples that one could observe. They therefore celebrated rites in which really something happened. An ox was slaughtered and the new member had to take a bath in the blood of the ox, for example. Actually, the Gregorian is built on what was to become the great entrance hallway and stairs to a huge temple for such a pagan mystery cult, but then Christianity came and the whole construction was never finished. So that's why we are here now. Christianity combines these two roots in the concept of mystery. In Christ, the whole meaning, plan, course of history is visible. Therefore, you can call it a mystery in Israel's sense. And those events can now be remembered in an involving way. Thus, also the mystery cult aspect applies to what the first Christians did. Fundamentally, I say, the Church only celebrates Christ's paschal mystery. What is the Christian way of dealing with mystery? We speak of celebrating or remembering it. For those of you who want to hear the vibes of the other languages that always resonate when we do Christian theology, memory is memoria, the celebration of memory is anamnesis or zikaron. So Christian remembering is a particular type of memory. Celebrating it is to allow it to present itself. Therefore, liturgical memory is not a looking back. It is rather a present experience. The Paschal mystery can be experienced in every celebration. So there is great presence, rather than only past event in it. But more than that, there's also an important future dimension to it. The Paschal mystery is founded in Christ's resurrection. The first Christians experienced Easter as Jesus' entering into unlimited life communion with God, and therefore as the beginning of the end, as the initiation of the final hope that all may be united in God, a reconciled life of all at the end of history. So, when we say the Church lives out of memory, it really means that Christians live in the joy of already feeling the future communion becoming reality in them and among them. That experience orients and strengthens them. It gives them the vision of what it is to be human, because it opens up the future fulfillment of humanity. This anticipated joy, this celebration of the future, is the experience that Christians traditionally call hope. How much time have we left?
I would say 10 minutes.
Okay. What does liturgical memory actually look like? Instead of listing steps, elements, one can simply use one word which catches the whole human activity of memoria. The memory is celebrated as confessio. Confession in the full sense includes three dynamics. It is the confession of God's saving action. It is, therefore, the grateful recognition that the Lord has done great things for us. Confession is praise, yada in Hebrew, which is also the root for thanking. That is then the Eucharistic dynamic of confession. Then confession is also a juridical word. It means to stand in for, to enter, ex homologeistai in Greek. A witness steps in publicly, that is exactly confessing, ex homologeistai. And a person to be baptized says, I believe, thus enters the reality of Christ, dies and rises with him, and becomes thus part of his body, ex homologeistai. In German, to celebrate can also be the word begehen. That literally means step on or enter. This may help us to sense, after the Eucharistic, the baptismal aspect of confessio. So confessing is praising and is entering. Thirdly, of course, it also means owing up to my failure, admitting my sins, acknowledging my own reality as weak in front of the transforming mercy of God. This is the penitential aspect of confessio. The Church lives out of the confessional celebration of the Paschal mystery. This sentence is really enough to understand the whole of Christian ritual culture and liturgical theology. For the rest of my time, I will only provide 10 qualifications and 1 application to the fundamental thesis. So first, I will tell you why the Church lives out of the confessional celebration of the Paschal mystery, yes and no. When exactly is the celebration of the Paschal mystery actually happening? The Church celebrates it in a yearly rhythm. In the 80 days from Ash Wednesday to the Ascension, that is from the 40 days of Lent through Holy Week to the 7 Easter weeks. The final moment of this Pasch is 10 days after Ascension, the opening of the post-Jesus time, that is Pentecost. At Pentecost, the Church commemorates the enthusing gift of Christ's Spirit. The Paschal memory is, however, not only commemorated in the flow of the year. It is also celebrated in a weekly rhythm. The Church assembles visibly every 8th day to celebrate the Day of the Lord, remembering Christ's Passion and celebrating his resurrection, which was, after all, discovered on a first day of the week. This is happening in the celebration of the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. This more frequent rhythm was even more accelerated in the Middle Ages. Then the Latin Church has begun to celebrate the Eucharist daily. Besides the events of Christ's Paschal mystery, there are other feasts that have to do with Christ, but do not celebrate an event. They are called idea feasts. They all originate in medieval piety. That is typical because the medieval Latin spirit is less one of temporality, event, becoming. It is a mindset of essence, static being. The liturgical reform of Vatican II has tried to associate these feasts to the events of the liturgical year. 3 of them are following Pentecost and were introduced in the High Middle Ages: Trinity Sunday, Corpus Christi, and Sacred Heart. Let me not go into all the details, but let me say there's one of these feasts which no longer exists in the liturgical celebration of post-Vatican II Council. That is the feast of the circumcision of Christ on the 1st of January. We are celebrating now only the name of Jesus. There is a commission of people pushing the Church to rediscover this as a link to the Church's and Jesus's, and therefore our Jewish roots. Joined to this circle of feasts of Christ is another cycle. Throughout the year, the Church celebrates Marian feasts. Quite interesting because they need not to be biblical. We are also basing some of the feasts in apocryphal readings. Another important element of the Church's liturgical year is the celebration of witnesses to Christ. They have their particular days in the annual rhythm. I would only like to tell you as much as this now. The Vatican II actually has something like a feast, but I do not know how many of us are aware of it. St. John the 23rd has his feast on the 11th of October. That is not his birthday, nor his day of death, but is the opening day of Vatican II. So it was instituted actually precisely to be a feast commemorating Vatican II. In another way, the Shoah also appears in the annual year through the Christian martyrs of the Nazi regime we are celebrating. When we hear, for example, during the Mass at the memorial of Edith Stein or Maximilian Kolbe, their life stories, our hearts, of course, wander to the concentration camps where they were killed. The annual liturgical calendar commemorates only events in Christian era. What about events of persons from the Hebrew Bible? Firstly, the Latin Church is commemorating events of biblical Israel's history, since they resonate explicitly in the great feasts of the Paschal festive circle. Easter is Pesach and Pentecost is Shavuot. Secondly, there's a local tradition that the Universal Church is only slowly rediscovering now. The Jerusalem Church has feast days for St. Moses, St. David, and so on. And there's a doctoral thesis recently published which is trying to feed this rediscovery into the Universal Church. What other remembrance of our relation to Israel is part of the annual liturgy? On Good Friday, the sixth intercession is this, for the Jewish people. Let us pray also for the Jewish people, to whom the Lord our God spoke first, that he may grant them to advance in love of his name and in faithfulness to his covenant. Almighty ever-living God, who bestowed your promises on Abraham and his descendants, hear graciously the prayers of your church, that the people you first made your own may attain the fullness of redemption through Christ our Lord. The yearly, weekly, and daily rhythm of Paschal memory, always celebrated in the sacrament of the Eucharist, is contrasted by a different rhythm of the sacraments in individual life rhythms. And then there are extraordinary ways of memory. For example, the Jubilee years. We are presently in an extraordinary Jubilee year of mercy. And another event of memory is John Paul II's asking for forgiveness for the mistakes of Christianity, where, as fourth was mentioned, also Christian guilt in front of Israel. We are now in the time of Advent, and Advent is another of these beautifully and meaningfully ambiguous words. Advent as Christ's coming under the Emperor Augustus, but not only looking back to a historical event, but also looking forward to Christ's second coming in his parousia Adventus. The Christian memory is an original widening of conscience. Every Christian celebration is putting ourselves into the Paschal mystery. We may thus know that our life is much more than what it now seems to be. Vatican II saw the basis for religious liberty and human dignity. Every person possesses a conscience and therefore has the right to liberty. If we try to rediscover the anthropology beneath the liturgical celebrations, there's more to the human being. He or she is part of the story of salvation. Even the failures, contradictions, defeats are part of the path to the life communion in God. Difference can therefore be encountered with welcoming openness. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Father Körner. We have extended a little bit our time, but we still have, I think, a quarter of an hour at least for questions, for comments. So the microphone will pass to anyone here in this room.
So I want to thank the two of you. I want to thank David Meyer especially for his last step about the Megillat HaShoah and the way you are taking side for the introduction of a new way of remembering. Why do I say that? Because I happen to belong to the group mentioned by Felix Körner, who asked for the reintroduction of the feast of circumcision on the 1st of January. We now have the name of Jesus on the 2nd of January, but it doesn't make sense because Jesus received his name on the 8th day after his birth, that is the 1st of January, when he was circumcised. And we think in this group that there is no stronger symbol of the link of the two covenants, because Jesus entered the covenant of his fathers being circumcised before giving his blood, the same blood, for the new covenant in the one we live in the church. But we introduced the request twice under two popes, and we were twice blocked. Not by the popes, but by the head of the congregation, actually, for divine cult, for liturgy. And we experience a kind of setback and disillusion, deception. But what you are witnessing, I mean, your way with some others to keep alive the memory of the Shoah, proposing something, for me is a way to not to lose hope. I mean, we need the Hamaskir, the one who keeps alive the memory. And you'll be remembered as one of the crazy guys who introduced this new symbol. I want to be remembered as one of the crazy guys who kept demanding for the reintroduction of the Feast of Circumcision, which was abolished a bit before the Council. So, thank you for keeping alive the memory of your people, of God even. We'll try to do the same.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. If I just want to say something on this, because of course, in a way, you can say there is more flexibility at attempting to be creative within Judaism, because we don't have the hierarchical structure, and therefore I'm not blocked by anybody officially. Okay. Nevertheless, it doesn't necessarily go very far, and that's the difficulty with this kind of exercise, is that you take a risk not of being blocked, but you take the risk of proposing something which actually doesn't fit with what has worked within Judaism. And I have to say, I mean, obviously I am very motivated by the project, and the project has been done. The scroll is in existence. The story of the Megillat HaShoah is read by an awful lot of communities in North America in particular, because it's coming out of the conservative movement. The physical scroll is read in a certain number of synagogues who have actually acquired and asked a sofer to do the scroll. But you're working without a protection net, in the sense that you're taking a gamble of saying, is it really that pain that I can transmit? And the story, I mean, I didn't have time to read the story. I thought maybe if I have time, I'll read to you the last chapter, but it's too long, so I didn't have time to read it. But it's a painful story. And the question about this, and it's something that Felix, that I was that struck me in the words that you've used, because you used more than once and more than tens of times the link between memory and celebration. Okay, feast, celebration, those words are coming back. There's no celebration there at all. There's no feast. It's a memory for pain, and the problem is, what do you do when you transmit pain? Obviously, memory is a very personal topic, and the way you spoke, it's obvious that you say, we want to be remembered for this, that, because we do all sorts of things, but somehow, even me, I do all sorts of things, but this is something that for me is the most important thing that I probably was involved with. But can you transmit pain if it's not when you have celebration behind? That's why I was struck by the way you phrased it. In the Haggadah of Pesach, which is also a ritual text, there is something which is called the charoset. The charoset is a sort of I don't know how familiar you are, but it's a sort of a mixture of dates, sugar, wine, apple that you sort of mix together. And it's supposed to remind you of the bitterness of slavery, which was about creating bricks and slavery and the labor, with all sorts of midrashim which are associated with it. The children were buried alive into the bricks, and so there's blood in it, so it had, all sorts of things. The amazing thing about this Pesach story and this ritual, which we don't have here, is that charoset is delicious. It's sweet. It's the celebration in a way, you're talking about. What a stroke of genius to have managed to transmit slavery through something which is wonderfully sweet. I can't do that, maybe because we don't have the space of time. I mean, what is sweet about the memory of the Shoah? Who would I be to suggest any sweetness in it? Even to soften the bitterness, I don't know how to do. And so with that attempt, which we were able to, with the Sofer, the guy who did the actual writing, we were able to create something, but it hasn't taken away the major question, which, apart from knowing whether it will take root or not, I mean, that I'm not too worried about that, we'll see. Well, I won't see, but okay, someone will see. It's whether or not this attempt fits into something that can be identified as a classical form of Jewish memory. On paper, it works. On the content, I think we always have we always have doubt, and that's why it's such a painful exercise. It's a difficult exercise, but it's something that we try to do because it's stronger than us, and we can't not do it. And there is a need of something has to be done. So the attempt is really done with a lot of humility. Despite the fact that it's a text and it's a finished product, it's still with a lot of humility and with a lot of question marks. And that's, yeah.
I think, David, what you are really proposing there with your colleagues is not just proposing another Jewish liturgy for another event. You said that at the beginning you said that feasts are rooted in texts, but I think it's really much more that the things happen the other way around. Texts come because of out of events, and what you are really doing there is saying Christians have their disasters and their joys, and when something new happens, they can integrate that into their liturgy by rereading their old scripture. So when we are celebrating a new saint, we don't write a new scripture, but we take scriptural passages that already exist and read them in the light, sometimes in the darkness, of that event we are commemorating. What you are really saying is our continuity is interrupted. Here we cannot reread our tradition in the light or darkness of an event. The event is so destructive that the Judaism we have lived is not continuing. I think the enmity you will see and the reception you will see depends on the massive claim you are doing, saying there is no continuity in this because of what happened until 1945.
Yeah, I mean, I take the liberty to answer like this, and I'm sorry because it takes away time for the question, but I'll do that briefly. But yeah, I mean, Felix, you've summed up, of course, the kernel of the issue. It is a theological reading of the Shoah that says this is a radical break which have no precedent, and that's why I quoted the text of André Meyer. When the Bible was written, it was written when Auschwitz didn't exist, and this is what it means. You know, Elie Wiesel has spoken a lot about that when he says, you know, to say, I think I'm just trying to quote from memory, but to say that I am the same Jew today as I was when I was a boy before the Shoah would be a complete lie. I cannot be the same. And the idea of, you know, the Talmudic debate that I skipped in the presentation, which was whether is it heretical to, you know, suggest somehow that there is that insufficiency of the biblical narrative in front of a real break, which then will justify the sort of answers I get, of course. The Talmud pretends that the book of Esther came in front of the sages. And if you have 1 second, I'll read to you the text. I mean, it's sort of funny because it's a Talmudic text, so it is an interesting. He said, Esther sent to the wise men saying, commemorate me for the future generations. Okay, so Esther comes and said, please commemorate for me. Okay, but they replied, no, you will incite the ill will of the nation against us. You know, remembering you will create tensions and so on. And then the debate goes on of saying, and in any case, there's all sorts of things that have happened that are similar. And then Esther says, no, what happened to me is not what can be expressed with what existed before. I need a new book. So the idea that somehow there is a break and there is an event that cannot be expressed with past documents, past narrative, is not completely out of touch with the Talmudic reality. The question, as you said, is, that's the theory. The practice is, how will the people feel? How the people will feel. The people of that generation, whether the survivors or the people of my generation, I don't think have a problem with the idea that somehow there is such a break, that there is a need for creativity, painful creativity, if something is to continue. I am not so sure that in the generations that follow, the theological anguish that I feel will be shared, and in which case, as you said, the response will be, you know what, that was a crazy, complete, out of touch with reality attempt. And this is very difficult to project ourselves into the future. When the Haggadah for Pesach was written, even though the Haggadah has an element of joy, of course, attached to it, okay, it was written 1,500 years after the Exodus from Egypt. And here we are coming up with a text of some sort, which is written 70 years after the event. They had the time to see what was the real theological impact so that they could shape their memory. Our fear is we don't have that time. And there's one thing I cannot live with, is this idea that in a generation or two, the Shoah for the Jews will be like history. And that's why there was a need to say, you know what, let's do something. Because at least there's a trace of the anguish of my time. That anguish might not be transmitted, it might disappear, but I find it so painful to imagine that my great-grandchildren, for example, would consider the Shoah as a blip in the history of Judaism. So the risk, I think, from my point of view, is worth the intensity of my emotion, in a way.
Maybe one more last question.
I warn you, if you don't ask, I will ask. As you know, I'm a scholar of Islam, and some very good contemporary Muslim Quran exegetes make an astonishing claim. they say, the Quran is not a book. That's a fascinating statement, because book, in our understanding, is often somebody sitting somewhere and designing a structure and then arguing, whereas the Quran is a chaotically, non-chronologically arranged half witness of an interaction. Half witness because you only have, according to Muslim belief, God's answers to challenges, questions, statements from the community which was coming into being in the 7th century on the Arab Peninsula. You don't have the questions, the situations to which God was reacting, and you don't have them arranged chronologically. Yeah? So it's not a book, it's part of an interaction. Still, it's tempting, because the Quran is always bound in the codex form, like our normal books, to consider it as a book. I find it quite intriguing that you, David, say it makes all the difference if I print this in the codical form, pages, or in a scroll. Because what is really the difference between scroll and codex? Many differences. You can put more material into a codex, but you always see the context in the scroll, yeah. And you cannot flip around without leaving things easily out. So I think we should also, in our cultures of so-called book religions, which is always a bit a strange wording, rediscover that book is a misleading concept, because it tempts to become a picking of little passages. And I once said it, I mean, these close readings without the liturgical context can be reforming, but normally they are radicalizing. So this is just the question, what is really the difference between a book codex and a scroll? Is it its liturgical solemnity?
It's true that, of course, the scroll enables many things, and you're completely right to point to the fact that you do need to go into the context, and you have to read more of it rather than the selected passage. You can't really put a marker into it and know exactly where it is. There's this whole thing, and one of the things in a synagogue, of course, is the one thing as a community rabbi at the time that you wanted to avoid was to do the Shabbat service without having checked exactly in the scroll exactly where you are, because the last thing you want is that you're at the wrong place and you have to unroll the scrolls. It takes 10 minutes and you don't find the place, and you have to invent a few songs so that people can be patient and so on. So a scroll has that ability to roll and unroll and see the wider context. I think one additional element which maybe from a Christian perspective you don't necessarily see with the scroll, we don't have a lot of ritual objects. We don't have a lot of material elements to almost to touch, I would say, even though technically you're not supposed to touch the scroll, but okay. So Jewishly speaking, it emphasizes a great deal the value of, or the importance of that event. But first and foremost, the scroll is the definition of what becomes canonical in the Talmudic context. The Talmudic context is, the question is, does the scroll makes your hand impure when you touch it? That's what defines a canonical book. Does it make your hand impure? It's an extremely interesting reading of the Talmudic passage. There is a book of Levinas, or a chapter in Levinas writing about how the scroll makes the hand impure. And I've always taken it as, of course, one element of it is the technicality, the texture, in a way, of the book that makes the hand impure. But also spiritually, there is an element of what I put into a scroll, which becomes a source of impurity, is always the flip coin of holiness. There is inspiration, but as you said, inspiration can also be a source of danger. It can be a source of radicalization, it can be a source of all sorts of things. And rendering the hands impure is this ability of a text which you consider to be sufficiently suggestive to be able to carry at the same time a beautiful message and a dangerous message. A typical example of that would be, of course, the story, it's an obvious one, but the story of the sacrifice of Isaac is a perfect example of the flip coin issue. Depends where you put the emphasis on the story, whether it becomes a source of purity or a source of impurity. And for us, the idea of this scroll is to say, there is element of danger in the commemoration of the Shoah as well. So to put it in a scroll has that element in it.
I see the clock, and we should really finish tonight. We heard, I think, we are all struck by this attempt to give new life, to be creative in our liturgical celebrations. It can be argued that Vatican II, in fact, in one of its most visible effects was, in fact, to set in motion a creative bringing to life the Christian, the Catholic liturgical celebrations. And of course, celebrations and memory are closely attached to traditions, so it is always a very delicate area that we are entering. But it may indeed be a call for what some people are asking, that in our days, where in this world that moves so quickly, and the understanding of a Christian symbology is lost in Christian societies, there's a call again for a new reform, a new creativity when it comes to liturgical celebrations that lead us in some ways to our next encounter that we are organizing for January 20th. The topic is liturgical celebration facing secularism. So in between we have Christmas, in between we have the new year. So to all of us, very good wishes for this end of this year. And thank you very much for dedicating these intensive days in preparation of Christmas and the end of the year, even to give us time for tonight's lectures.